In today's video, we're looking at the most horrifying revenge deaths ever recorded, from a wedding photographer pushed off a 300-foot cliff to a financial predator tortured in an isolated mountain cabin. It was February 14th, 2017, when Cameron Doyle's manipulative nature finally caught up with her in the most horrific way imaginable. The 29-year-old wedding photographer had built her reputation on capturing perfect moments, but behind the lens lurked a woman who thrived on destroying the very love she pretended to celebrate. Cameron specialized in high-end weddings along California's coast, using her access to intimate moments to gather compromising information about her clients. Her calculating personality and sharp eye for human weakness made her a master blackmailer. She would photograph guests in compromising positions, capture private conversations, and fabricate evidence when reality didn't serve her purposes. Jake Johnson had been one of her victims. The 32-year-old landscape architect hired Cameron to photograph his engagement party 8 months earlier, never suspecting she would use doctored images to convince his fiancée that he was cheating. The lies destroyed everything Blake held dear: his relationship, his unborn child, and his faith in humanity. While Cameron celebrated another successful manipulation, Blake's world crumbled. His fiancée left, taking their baby, and Blake spiraled into depression and unemployment. But grief transformed into something darker as he began planning his revenge. Cameron maintained a Valentine's Day tradition of visiting Mendocino's cliffside rose garden alone, photographing herself with a single red rose against the sunset. She posted about this ritual extensively on social media, never realizing she was providing Blake with the perfect opportunity. The garden perched 300 feet above jagged rocks and crashing Pacific waves. Blake knew Cameron would arrive at 5:30 p.m., just as she had every February 14th for the past 5 years. He waited in the maze of pathways, watching as she posed with her rose near the cliff's edge. When Blake emerged from the shadows, Cameron initially didn't recognize the broken man whose life she had destroyed. He calmly explained who he was and what her lies had cost him. Cameron's arrogant dismissal quickly turned to panic as she realized the danger. She attempted to flee toward the garden entrance, but Blake blocked her path. During the violent struggle, Cameron dropped her rose as Blake grabbed her wrist. In a moment of pure rage, he shoved her backward with both hands. Cameron stepped back, and the loose soil at the cliff's edge crumbled beneath her feet. She plunged the full 300 feet down the rocky cliff face, her body striking multiple granite outcroppings before crashing onto the rocks below. The devastating impact shattered her ribs and fractured her skull, killing her instantly. Hours later, rescuers found her broken body on the rocks, the red rose lying beside her in the debris. The scene initially appeared to be an accidental fall during a photography session. However, investigators eventually uncovered Jake's connection to Cameron and evidence of premeditation. The case revealed the dark side of Cameron's photography business and the lives she had destroyed through her manipulations. Jake was arrested for first-degree murder, though he maintained that justice had finally been served for all of Cameron's victims. The investigation uncovered at least 12 other couples whose relationships Cameron had deliberately sabotaged for her own twisted entertainment and financial gain. It was August 15th, 2018, when Renee Callister's childhood cruelty finally caught up with her. The 31-year-old marketing executive had built a successful career, but her polished exterior concealed the heart of a vicious bully who had never faced consequences for the psychological torture she inflicted on vulnerable children. Renee possessed a narcissistic personality that made her incapable of genuine empathy. Even as an adult, she viewed others as objects for her entertainment, dismissing the pain she caused with casual indifference. Her social media showcased a perfect life, filled with luxury vacations and designer clothes, funded by her ruthless corporate tactics. 20 years earlier, at Camp Wildwood, Renee had been the ringleader of systematic abuse against Jordan Whitaker. The shy 12-year-old became her favorite target, enduring daily humiliation that included being forced to eat garbage. having his belongings destroyed, and being locked in storage closets for hours. Renee's cruelty drove Jordan to write a suicide note, though he never followed through. Jordan Whitaker, now 33, had spent decades in therapy recovering from the trauma Renee inflicted. The former victim worked as a property caretaker for the county, which gave him access to the abandoned Camp Wildwood. While Renee thrived in her corporate world, Jordan struggled with depression and anxiety that stemmed directly from her childhood torture. The camp had been closed for 15 years, its buildings slowly rotting in the wilderness. Jordan maintained the property, walking daily through the locations where his innocence had been destroyed. He kept his childhood suicide note as a reminder of how close Renee had pushed him to the edge. Renee's Instagram posts revealed her plan to visit the old camp for a nostalgic photo shoot. She wanted to recreate childhood memories for her lifestyle blog, completely oblivious to the pain those memories represented. Jordan saw this as divine justice finally presenting itself after 2 decades of waiting. On that August afternoon, Renee arrived alone at 2 p.m., her expensive camera equipment contrasting sharply with the decaying surroundings. She posed cheerfully in locations where she had once tormented children, treating the abandoned camp like a backdrop for social media content. Jordan emerged from the old dining hall, carrying his childhood suicide note. When he confronted her with the evidence of what her cruelty had nearly caused, Renee's reaction was everything Jordan expected. She laughed, dismissing their childhood interactions as harmless fun while showing zero remorse. Her complete lack of remorse triggered something primal in Jordan. 20 years of suppressed rage exploded as he chased her through the rotting camp buildings toward the old rope course, where she had once pushed him off platforms and cut his safety ropes for entertainment. Renee became entangled in deteriorated rope obstacles 30 feet above the ground. The equipment was now a death trap of frayed cables and rotting wood. Jordan stood below, watching as Renee begged for help, while he recited every cruel thing she had done to him and other vulnerable children. The rope finally snapped. Renee plummeted 30 feet onto broken wooden posts that had once supported camp signs. One pierced through her abdomen while another fractured her spine, paralyzing her instantly. She remained conscious for only minutes, experiencing a brief but intense moment of helplessness she had once inflicted on others, before succumbing to massive blood loss. Jordan left her body at the camp and reported finding her the next day during his routine inspection. The investigation initially supported accidental death, but Jordan's connection to Renee eventually led to his arrest for murder. It was March 22, 2016, when Blake Thornton's reckless disregard for human life finally led to his own violent death on a dark Tennessee highway. The 28-year-old came from a wealthy family whose connections had repeatedly saved him from facing real consequences for his dangerous behavior. Blake worked as a trust fund manager at his family's investment firm. His privileged upbringing had created an arrogant personality that viewed rules as suggestions for lesser people. He treated his multiple DUI arrests as minor inconveniences. Exactly 1 year earlier, Blake had been driving drunk when he struck and killed 6-year-old Emma Lowell in a crosswalk outside her elementary school. The little girl was walking home when Blake's speeding BMW sent her small body flying 30 feet through the air. He fled the scene immediately. Trina Lowell, Emma's 34-year-old mother, watched her only child take her final breath in the hospital that night. The single mother had devoted her entire life to raising Emma. Blake's wealthy family hired expensive lawyers who got him probation, claiming the child had darted into traffic. The injustice consumed Trina completely. She quit her job as a dental hygienist and spent the entire year studying Blake's patterns. She learned he visited Murphy's Tavern every Tuesday night, always leaving around 11:30 p.m. completely intoxicated. His route home took him down Highway 67, a winding mountain road. Trina spent months obsessing over revenge. Online forums and repair manuals taught her how cars worked, and she practiced on junkyard wrecks until her hands moved with mechanical precision. For weeks, Trina followed Blake to Murphy's Tavern parking lot, waiting until he was inside drinking before sliding beneath his silver BMW. She studied every inch of the undercarriage, rehearsing exactly where and how to strike. That fatal Tuesday night, while Blake was inside bragging about beating another DUI charge, Trina made her move. She slipped behind the front wheel well and severed the brake line with one precise cut, deep enough to ensure total failure but hidden well enough to pass a casual glance. At 11:30 p.m., Blake stumbled to his car, completely unaware that his vehicle had just been transformed into a death trap by a grieving mother seeking justice. At mile marker 23, Blake approached the sharp curve where he had previously crashed without consequence. This time, when he pressed the brake pedal, it sank uselessly to the floor. The severed brake line left him with no stopping power, and the BMW carried its full speed straight toward the guardrail at 55 miles per hour. Blake yanked the wheel desperately, but the heavy car barely responded. With no way to slow down, the vehicle plowed through the metal guardrail and became airborne over the 150-foot embankment. For 3 terrifying seconds, Blake experienced the same helplessness his victim had felt. The BMW flipped 3 times down the rocky slope. Blake's body was thrown violently around the interior as windows exploded and the roof collapsed. During the second flip, his neck snapped against the door frame, instantly paralyzing him. Blake remained conscious but unable to move as gasoline leaked from the ruptured fuel tank. Broken glass had shredded his face and arms, while twisted metal pinned his legs. He could smell the gas fumes growing stronger. Blake lay trapped and paralyzed, his broken neck and massive internal injuries stealing his strength within minutes. In those final moments, he finally understood the terror his victim had experienced. He slipped into unconsciousness from blood loss before death claimed him. Trina had been visiting Emma's grave during the crash, establishing a perfect alibi. The investigation initially ruled it another drunk driving accident. However, forensic analysis eventually revealed the mechanical sabotage, leading investigators to Trina. It was December 8, 2019, when Sabrina Lowell's home-wrecking affair finally led to her death in the most brutal way imaginable. The 29-year-old real estate agent had built her career on charm and manipulation, but her greatest conquest would become her downfall when she targeted the wrong family. Sabrina possessed a narcissistic personality that thrived on stealing what belonged to others. She specialized in targeting married men, viewing their wives as obstacles rather than human beings with feelings. Her stunning looks and calculated seduction techniques had ended dozens of marriages without any remorse for the destruction she caused. Sabrina had seduced David Anderson, a successful architect married to Kelly Anderson. She systematically targeted him during house showings, using her real estate expertise to create intimate situations. She convinced him that his wife didn't appreciate him, and that he deserved someone better who understood his ambitions. Kelly Anderson, 35, had been married to David for 12 years and was raising their twin daughters when Sabrina entered their lives like a predator. The devoted mother worked part-time as a bookkeeper to support David's career, never suspecting her husband was having an affair with their real estate agent. When David left his family, he drained their joint bank accounts and moved in with Sabrina, using their life savings. Kelly discovered the affair through credit card statements, showing expensive hotel stays and jewelry purchases. Watching her 8-year-old daughters cry themselves to sleep, asking why daddy didn't love them, transformed her grief into murderous rage. Sabrina flaunted the relationship on social media, posting photos of expensive vacations and designer gifts that David bought with his family's money. She showed no remorse for destroying a marriage, and seemed to enjoy the power she held over both David and his abandoned family. The Fontainebleau Hotel in Miami had been their regular meeting place during the affair. Sabrina booked the same penthouse suite monthly, creating a romantic sanctuary where she had systematically stolen another woman's husband. Kelly learned about these getaways through private investigator reports and credit card records. On that December evening, Kelly intercepted David's phone and sent Sabrina a text asking her to meet at their usual suite. Sabrina arrived at 7 p.m. expecting a romantic evening, completely unaware that the betrayed wife had been planning this confrontation for months. Kelly was waiting when Sabrina entered with champagne and lingerie, clearly expecting to celebrate another successful manipulation. The confrontation began with Kelly calmly explaining how Sabrina's affair had destroyed her family and left her children traumatized by their father's abandonment. Sabrina showed no remorse and bragged about stealing David, claiming Kelly had been a boring wife who didn't deserve him. She laughed about the children's tears and suggested Kelly should be grateful for being freed from an unhappy marriage. The complete lack of empathy triggered something primal in Kelly. She struck Sabrina with the champagne bottle, causing her to fall and hit her head on the marble coffee table. The blow caused a severe concussion, leaving Sabrina disoriented and unable to defend herself properly. Kelly dragged the dazed Sabrina to the suite's balcony on the 20th floor, overlooking Miami's glittering skyline. She forced her against the balcony railing, gripping her shoulders tightly. Sabrina's head cleared enough to realize the danger. She struggled desperately, clawing at Kelly's hands while pleading for mercy. But Kelly was stronger, fueled by months of rage over every cruel thing Sabrina had said about the children. With one final violent shove, Kelly pushed her over the railing and let gravity do the rest. Sabrina plummeted through the night air, her screams ending when her body struck the pavement 200 feet below. Kelly cleaned the suite and escaped through the service elevator. Security initially believed Sabrina had jumped due to relationship problems. However, the investigation eventually uncovered Kelly's connection and evidence of the confrontation, leading to her arrest. It was November 3, 2015, when Jordan Whitaker's arrogant disregard for patient safety finally caught up with him. The 45-year-old cardiac surgeon had built his reputation on performing unnecessary operations for profit, but his greed would lead to his own death. Jordan possessed an ego that matched his surgical skills, viewing patients as sources of income rather than human beings. His arrogant personality made him believe he was untouchable. He routinely ignored proper procedures and took dangerous shortcuts to maximize profits. 6 months earlier, Jordan had performed a completely unnecessary cardiac procedure on Robert Anderson, a 62-year-old retired teacher who came in for routine chest pain. Despite clear evidence that medication would resolve the issue, Jordan convinced the family that immediate surgery was required. During the operation, Jordan's reckless techniques led to massive complications. Robert suffered a stroke on the operating table due to Jordan's negligent surgical methods. When Robert died 3 days later, Jordan falsified medical records to blame pre-existing conditions. Gina Anderson, Robert's 38-year-old daughter and a surgical nurse at St. Mary's Hospital, knew her father had been healthy before Jordan's unnecessary surgery. She had worked alongside Jordan for years, witnessing his dangerous practices. Her father's death transformed her grief into calculated desire for justice. Working in the same hospital gave Gina intimate knowledge of surgical procedures, medication protocols, and Jordan's personal habits. She discovered that Jordan scheduled his own routine medical procedures during off hours to avoid scrutiny from colleagues. Jordan had scheduled a private gallbladder surgery for himself, using his influence to demand it be done late at night when the hospital was nearly empty. He didn't want colleagues gossiping about his health, and his arrogance made him believe he could bend rules without consequence. At 10 p.m., he arrived for the operation, trusting Gina to prepare his anesthesia while the skeleton night crew handled other emergencies. His supreme arrogance prevented him from suspecting that the nurse whose father he had killed might seek revenge. Gina had spent months planning the perfect murder. She replaced Jordan's standard anesthesia with a lethal combination of potassium chloride and succinylcholine. The potassium would stop his heart, while the paralytic agent would prevent him from calling for help. As Jordan lay on the operating table, the anesthesiologist injected what he believed was routine pre-operative sedation. But Gina had already swapped the medication, replacing it with the lethal mix. The potassium chloride immediately began disrupting Jordan's cardiac rhythm, while the succinylcholine paralyzed his respiratory muscles, leaving him unable to breathe or call for help. Within 90 seconds, Jordan experienced complete cardiac arrest, but remained fully conscious due to the paralytic agent preventing him from speaking or moving. His brain continued functioning for approximately 4 minutes while his body was completely paralyzed. He experienced the absolute terror of conscious death, unable to move, speak, or breathe as his organs systematically shut down. His eyes remained open and aware until his brain succumbed to oxygen deprivation. Jordan, who had caused so many unnecessary deaths through his surgical arrogance, died experiencing the same helplessness his victims had felt. His body was discovered by the night shift supervisor 20 minutes later. Gina disposed of the evidence and reported finding Jordan's body during routine checks. The death was initially attributed to sudden cardiac arrest from work-related stress. However, routine toxicology reports eventually revealed the modified anesthesia cocktail. The investigation uncovered Gina's access to restricted medications and her motive. Security footage ultimately led to her arrest for premeditated murder. It was June 18, 2017, when Molly Anderson's financial predatory behavior finally led to her brutal death in an isolated Colorado mountain cabin. The 32-year-old financial advisor had built her career on stealing from the most vulnerable members of society, but her greed would cost her everything. Molly possessed a charming personality that masked her sociopathic tendencies and complete lack of empathy for elderly victims. She specialized in targeting seniors with dementia, using her credentials to gain trust before systematically draining their life savings. 3 months earlier, Molly had targeted 78-year-old Margaret Doyle, a retired librarian living in a modest nursing home. Using forged documents and Margaret's stolen identity, Molly transferred the elderly woman's entire retirement fund into offshore accounts, leaving her unable to pay for care. Camille Doyle, Margaret's 27-year-old granddaughter, discovered the theft when the nursing home called about unpaid bills. Camille worked as a retail manager and had been Margaret's only family since her parents died. Watching her beloved grandmother cry about losing her home transformed Camille's grief into murderous rage. Camille spent months tracking down the stolen money through bank records. Her investigation led her to Molly, who had already spent Margaret's life savings on luxury cars and expensive vacations. The complete lack of remorse Molly showed when confronted fueled Camille's desire for revenge. Molly owned a remote family cabin in the Colorado mountains, located 50 miles from the nearest town. She used this isolated retreat whenever authorities began investigating her financial crimes, believing the remote location provided perfect cover. Camille learned about the cabin through surveillance and social media posts. She noted that Molly retreated there whenever she felt threatened by law enforcement, always traveling alone with no security systems or neighbors for miles. On that June evening, Molly arrived at the cabin planning to lay low until her latest investigation cooled down. She had recently stolen from 3 more elderly victims and needed time for the heat to die down. Camille had been watching the cabin for weeks, learning Molly's routines and preparing for the perfect opportunity. She waited until Molly was settled inside before making her move, knowing no one would hear the screams in the isolated wilderness. Camille confronted Molly at the cabin, presenting detailed evidence of the theft and demanding the return of her grandmother's money. When Molly laughed and claimed the elderly woman was too senile to manage money anyway, Camille's rage exploded into violence. She attacked Molly with a fireplace poker, fracturing her skull and knocking her unconscious. Camille then tied the unconscious Molly to a chair in the cabin's basement and waited for her to regain consciousness before revealing her plan for prolonged torture. Over the next several hours, Camille systematically broke Molly's fingers and toes with a hammer while forcing her to watch videos of Margaret crying about losing her home. She wanted Molly to understand the pain she had caused to innocent people. Camille used a knife to slowly carve dollar signs into Molly's arms and chest, symbolizing the money she had stolen from vulnerable seniors. Each cut was deliberate and calculated to maximize pain while keeping Molly conscious as long as possible. Molly finally died from shock and blood loss after hours of systematic torture. Her body bore evidence of Camille's methodical revenge, with dozens of cuts spelling out the word thief across her torso. Camille set fire to the cabin with Molly's body still inside, believing the flames would erase every trace of her revenge. She drove back to the city, confident that investigators would find nothing more than an accidental fire. However, forensic experts later discovered fractures in the charred remains that pointed to violent assault before death. Combined with financial records linking Camille to Molly and evidence of premeditation, the investigation built a solid case. The death was reclassified from accidental to homicide, leading to Camille's arrest for first-degree murder. If you found these endings as disturbing as we did, it was August 17, 2013. Apodaca's industrial sprawl stretched across the outskirts of Monterrey, where workers at a small vehicle depot lingered past closing time. Alejandro Alex Flores stood beneath a street lamp, chatting with two co-workers about weekend plans. What they didn't know was that Alex's quiet resistance over the past few months had reached its breaking point. Alex was a 32-year-old school bus mechanic. He was known for being organized, punctual, and soft-spoken. He'd worked the same job for 8 years, maintaining the yellow buses that carried children through San Nicolas. His modest house sat on a quiet street where he lived with his wife Maria and their 2 children, ages 6 and 4. Friends described him as a man who kept his head down and took care of his family, exactly the kind of person who should have been left alone. When a local gang began demanding weekly protection fees from neighborhood businesses, Alex made a decision that would cost him everything. He refused to pay, believing that giving in meant permanent entanglement with criminals who would never stop asking for more. Over the following weeks, he filed quiet complaints with police, submitting license plates and descriptions anonymously. There was no formal protection program, just vague promises of follow-up that never materialized. Days went on and the threats escalated. Gang members began mentioning his family by name, asking about his children's school schedule. Alex confided in close friends, but still showed up to work every day, hoping the situation would resolve itself. That evening, as the shop lights dimmed and his co-workers smoked cigarettes on the curb, Alex looked more tense than usual. He'd recently learned from a neighbor that strangers had been asking questions about his kids. At 7:45 in the evening, 2 men approached from the end of the street. According to eyewitness Jose Ruiz, one wore a dark hoodie pulled low over his face. The other had a bandana masking his features. They walked with purpose but didn't run, closing the distance quickly. When they were within arm's reach, the hooded man said plainly that it was for not paying, and before Alex could react, he drew a short blade from his waistband and lunged. Alex turned to run but managed only 2 steps before the attacker slashed his neck from behind. He stumbled forward and collapsed into the gutter, one hand gripping his throat as blood poured. Jose shouted and rushed forward as the second man delivered a vicious kick to Alex's ribs. Both assailants fled down the narrow alley, disappearing into the maze of industrial buildings. Jose knelt beside his co-worker, desperately trying to compress the wound while another mechanic ran for shop rags and called for help. Within minutes, Alex's breathing became shallow, then stopped entirely. Paramedics arrived 12 minutes later, but it was far too late. Alex had bled out, the fatal wound a deep slash across the side of his neck. Surveillance footage from a nearby warehouse captured part of the attack, providing investigators with critical evidence. Using Jose's detailed description, police arrested 2 suspects in early September, both low-level gang members under 25. Alex's second cousin arranged a private funeral in Monterrey, attended by family and co-workers who remembered him as a good man who'd simply tried to do the right thing. The local press ran a brief story in the crime section. Mechanic killed over extortion refusal. No larger investigation followed. The garage reopened 2 days later, and life continued as if Alex Flores had never existed. It was April 5, 2014. A gray Saturday evening was settling over South Bristol. Sarah Milton turned the corner toward her front door, her canvas library bag bumping softly against her hip as street lamps flickered on in the dusk. What she didn't realize was that someone had been waiting for this exact moment. Sarah wasn't the type to make enemies. The 45-year-old part-time librarian at Redfield Primary School was known for her calm, careful manner and gentle way with children. She lived alone in a modest terraced house after her divorce 3 years earlier, but remained close to her sister Claire and her 2 young nieces. Friends described her as someone who avoided confrontation and preferred the quiet company of books to the complications of adult drama. A year earlier, Sarah's peaceful world had been shattered when one of her nieces made a troubling comment during a sleepover. The 8-year-old had mentioned something inappropriate about her stepfather, Sarah's brother-in-law, Marcus Webb. Sarah spent sleepless nights wrestling with what to do before finally reporting the incident to social services. She knew the consequences would be devastating, but protecting her niece mattered more than family harmony. The investigation that followed tore the family apart. Marcus was arrested and charged, but the case collapsed at trial due to insufficient evidence. He was acquitted after the defense successfully argued that the child's testimony was unreliable. Marcus publicly claimed his life had been ruined by false accusations, losing his job, and facing community suspicion. Privately, he blamed Sarah for destroying everything he'd built. In the weeks following the trial, Sarah tried to resume her quiet routines. She cataloged books, helped struggling readers, and maintained her professional composure. But neighbors later said she'd grown wary, double-checking locks, pausing when coming home after dark, glancing over her shoulder more frequently. The family rift had left her isolated, cut off from her sister who'd chosen to believe her husband's denials. That Saturday evening, Sarah had stayed late at the school library, organizing new arrivals for Monday's classes. By the time she reached her block, dusk had settled, and a light drizzle had begun. As she approached her porch, she noticed a figure in a gray hoodie lingering near the bus stop. She hesitated, keys in hand, but the man didn't move. Reassuring herself it was nothing, she unlocked her front door. According to eyewitness Emma Hayes, who lived across the street, the figure crossed the road at a jog and reached Sarah's door within seconds. Before Sarah could close it behind her, the man raised a small handgun and fired twice through the narrow opening. The shots echoed through the quiet neighborhood. One bullet struck Sarah's chest, the other her face. She fell backwards through the doorway. Emma watched in horror as the shooter shoved Sarah's body with his foot, sending her tumbling down the short porch steps to land face first on the concrete. Emma screamed and dialed emergency services while her teenage son waited for the man to leave before running across the street with a towel, desperately trying to compress the bleeding. Another neighbor brought a blanket, but Sarah was already beyond help. She never regained consciousness. Police arrived within 7 minutes, but paramedics declared Sarah dead at the scene. The coroner's report listed the cause of death as massive head trauma and a fatal gunshot wound to the chest. Within 48 hours, officers arrested Marcus Webb at a flat in Bedminster, where they recovered clothing matching Emma's description, and a handgun later confirmed to match the ballistic evidence from the scene. Gunshot residue was also found on Webb's hands, though investigators noted its limited evidentiary value compared to the ballistic match. Sarah Milton's funeral was held the following Friday at St. Luke's Church, just blocks from the school where she'd worked. Dozens of children, parents, and former colleagues attended, placing daisies and paper cranes beside her casket. In the days that followed, authorities confirmed that Marcus Webb would face charges for murder and firearm possession. The trial began 6 months later, but for Sarah Milton, justice would come too late. It was September 14, 2015. The narrow lane behind Howrah Market buzzed with the day's final movements. Amir Ali, a 27-year-old tailor, turned off the bare bulb inside his workshop and stepped into the alley that would claim his life. Amir was just a craftsman with steady hands and a growing clientele who rented a small ground-floor unit, working long hours stitching saris, school uniforms, and cheap men's trousers. Clients described him as polite and serious, always undercharging regulars. His calloused fingers moved with practiced precision across fabric, building a modest life one stitch at a time. But 3 months earlier, everything changed. A street gang with links to a local councillor approached Amir with a proposition that would destroy his quiet existence. They demanded he help funnel campaign funds through bogus tailoring orders, a common scheme in Kolkata's political underworld. Amir refused, unwilling to compromise his integrity for dirty money. The consequences came swiftly. Posters appeared near his shop calling him a traitor to the ward. A local tea stall vendor warned him to stay careful. Friends urged him to relocate, but Amir stayed. He told neighbors he wouldn't be bullied out of the life he'd built with his own hands. That Monday afternoon, Amir worked until just past 5 o'clock. As he pulled the corrugated shutter halfway down, he waved to Sumita Sharma, a widow who lived in the next unit. She smiled and began locking her gate. Neither saw the two men waiting. Sumita heard it first. raised voices, the scrape of metal against stone. When she stepped outside, she witnessed Amir being dragged into the narrow passage by two men in jeans and sandals. One wore a bandana over his mouth. They pinned Amir against the wall beside his sewing machine. He fought desperately, blocking the first swing of a metal rod, twisting out of their grip, but one attacker slammed the rod across Amir's shoulder, and he staggered. The second plunged a short knife into his chest. Amir fell hard onto concrete, blood spreading around his legs. The taller man struck again, this time to his skull. His body went still. Sumita screamed and ran for help. Two men from a nearby fruit stall rushed in, grabbing one attacker while the other fled. Amir lay motionless beside his broken sewing stool, blood seeping into half-stitched uniforms scattered across the floor. An ambulance arrived 20 minutes later, but Amir had already succumbed to head trauma and blood loss. His body was taken to a government hospital, then released for cremation. Neighbors left garlands and candles at the shuttered shop. Amir's funeral was held the next morning at the local mosque, attended by family, clients, and fellow artisans who quietly walked behind the hearse through the old market lanes. His sewing machine, still stained, was later moved to his parents' home in Baruipur. Within 48 hours, police confirmed the arrest of one suspect and launched a search for the second. Officials also opened a parallel investigation into the counselor's alleged ties to the extortion ring. It was December 2, 2016. The cold had set in early that year across Krakow's Nowa Huta district, and the courtyard between concrete apartment blocks echoed with the crunch of boots on frost. Tomasz Wojcik pulled his white service van into his usual spot, headlights cutting briefly across cracked pavement before everything went dark forever. Tomasz was a 34-year-old licensed electrician who had spent 12 years working residential jobs across Krakow, building a reputation as dependable, soft-spoken, and almost obsessively thorough. Friends described him as private but principled, traits that would ultimately cost him his life. 6 months earlier, those principles had put Tomasz on a collision course with his past. When his old friend Dawid M. drove drunk and killed a pedestrian, Dawid expected the silence that often protects friendships in tight-knit communities. Instead, Tomasz gave the court a full statement, detailing everything he'd witnessed. As Dawid was led away in handcuffs, he shouted across the courtroom that Tomasz would regret this. The threat hung over Tomasz. He avoided the bars and old hangouts, telling his wife Lydia not to worry. They had 2 young sons, and most evenings Tomasz came home directly after work, seeking the safety of routine and family. That Friday evening, Lydia was warming pierogi in the kitchen when she heard the familiar rumble of his van. She glanced at the clock, 6:43 p.m., and called to the boys to wash up. Outside, Tomasz stepped from the driver's side and swung his toolbox down, unaware that death was waiting between 2 parked cars. From his second-floor window, Pavel Nowak, a nearby resident, saw the figure emerge from the shadows, a man in a dark jacket and gloves, holding something metallic. At first, Pavel assumed it was a tool, but moments later he heard a sharp shout that made him realize something was wrong. The attacker ran toward Tomasz with a furious scream, threatening retribution. Tomasz turned and raised his arms in defense, but the first hammer blow shattered his forearm, and the second struck near his temple. He staggered and dropped to one knee. The third blow landed on his skull with a sickening crack, sending him collapsing beside his van's front wheel. Lydia opened the building door just as the hammer was lifted again. Her scream echoed through the courtyard. The attacker hesitated, then bolted toward the alley beside the garages. Pavel and another neighbor rushed out barefoot, chasing the killer through side streets, but he vanished into Nowa Huta's maze of concrete blocks. They stopped searching and called for help. Tomasz lay unconscious, bleeding heavily from skull and mouth. Lydia knelt beside him, trying to cradle his head. He never regained consciousness. Paramedics arrived within 9 minutes, but Tomasz was pronounced dead an hour later at the hospital. Authorities opened a homicide investigation within 24 hours, naming Dawid M. as a primary suspect based on motive and prior threats. A citywide warrant was issued, and surveillance footage from nearby garages was collected, but no arrest had been made by the year's end. Tomasz's funeral was held 3 days later at the Rakowicki Cemetery, attended by hundreds of co-workers, neighbors, and former clients. His wife Lydia stood beside the coffin with their 2 sons. It was June 19th, 2017. A quiet winter evening was settling over Melbourne's outer suburbs, and the Dandenong Creek Trail had thinned out from its usual bustle of cyclists and commuters. Grace Thompson ran alone along a wooded stretch, her breath visible in the chill air, earbuds in, jacket zipped high, unaware she was running toward her final moments. Grace was a 29-year-old child welfare caseworker at a mid-sized NGO focused on family support services, dedicated to protecting vulnerable children and families. Her colleagues described her as thorough and principled, qualities that had recently put her life in danger. In the months prior, Grace had submitted detailed internal reports exposing financial mismanagement by senior staff, specifically inflated travel reimbursements and grant money diverted to personal expenses. While the board took public steps toward reform, Grace privately told a friend that one board member, Darren O., had become cold and hostile, believing she had made him a target. Grace maintained a strict routine: office by 8 a.m., field visits midday, trail run after work. That Monday, she left the building at 5:12 p.m., still wearing her staff ID clipped to her pocket. The trail entrance was 5 minutes from her apartment, a familiar path she'd run hundreds of times before. At approximately 5:41 p.m., Paul Chen was jogging 60 feet behind Grace when he witnessed something that would haunt him forever. A man in a gray hoodie stepped from the brush. Paul initially thought he might be homeless until he noticed the gun in the man's hand. The man blocked Grace's path and demanded that she hand over her phone. She removed one earbud, confused, as he told her to delete the files. Grace backed away, refusing, and the man raised a small black revolver and shot her once in the abdomen at close range. She collapsed instantly onto the cold asphalt. Paul shouted and sprinted toward them, but the gunman fled into the adjacent woodland. Paul remained with Grace, who was bleeding heavily from the wound. Struggling to speak, she asked him for help as he pressed his jacket against the injury and called emergency services. Paramedics arrived within 11 minutes. Grace was rushed to Royal Melbourne Hospital in critical condition, underwent emergency surgery, but died 2 hours later from internal bleeding. Detectives recovered CCTV footage from a nearby park entrance, showing Darren O. lingering in the area shortly before the attack. He was arrested the next morning and charged with premeditated murder. Grace's funeral was held 4 days later at a small church in Ferntree Gully, attended by family, co-workers, and several former clients who credited her with changing their lives. Her parents requested no media presence, and the service remained quiet, personal, and untelevised. In response to her death, Victoria Police launched a review of threats against whistleblowers in non-profit sectors. Officials opened a separate inquiry into the NGO's financial practices and board oversight procedures. It was October 11th, 2018. A cool, bright Thursday settled over the edge of Quebec City, where the shipping yard near the St. Lawrence River. Lawrence River stood quiet under a pale autumn sky. Containers were stacked in neat grids, forklifts parked in rows, radios silent. It was lunchtime. Marc-André Boucher crossed the gravel lot alone, heading toward his pickup truck and walking straight into a deadly confrontation. Marc-André was a 51-year-old forklift operator who had spent 16 years working the industrial port. Known for being even-tempered and hard-working, he rarely missed a shift, kept meticulous logs of cargo movements, and often helped train new hires. Outside of work, he lived a quiet life with his wife in Beauport and took pride in small things, tinkering with old radios, mowing his lawn, and staying out of trouble. 3 months earlier, during a routine inventory audit, Marc-André uncovered discrepancies in load counts and flagged them to HR. A follow-up investigation revealed that foreman Serge Lamontagne had been falsifying outgoing shipment data for years, inflating hours, and moving product without records. Marc-André's detailed statement was instrumental in the inquiry that led to Serge's suspension, though he remained on site in a reduced role. By early October, tension had returned to the yard. Serge avoided eye contact and kept his distance from the man who had exposed his crimes. Marc-André didn't speak much about the situation. That Thursday, at approximately 12:17 p.m., Marc-André paused between rows of containers to check a text from his wife. He held his lunchbox in one hand, phone in the other, completely unaware that death was approaching from the shadows. Lucy Tremblay, a co-worker walking nearby, witnessed what happened next. Serge emerged from between two containers carrying something in his hand. She initially thought it was a tool until she saw him raise it with murderous intent. Serge approached quickly, and without warning, raised a large steel wrench and struck Marc-Andre across the back of the head with devastating force. The sound of impact was sharp and immediate. Marc-Andre dropped to one knee, then collapsed sideways onto the gravel. Lucy screamed as Serge stepped forward and struck again, this time to the temple with brutal precision. Lucy rushed in, grabbing Serge's arm, but he shoved her off with a blank expression that she later said chilled her to the bone. Other workers, hearing the commotion, ran from the break room. Serge dropped the bloody wrench and fled between trailers toward the back gate, leaving Marc-Andre motionless on the ground, with blood pooling beneath his right ear. One of his co-workers phoned for help. Paramedics arrived within 9 minutes and confirmed death at the scene from massive head trauma. Police located Serge at his apartment in Beauport that afternoon and arrested him without incident. Murder charges were filed the next morning. Marc-Andre's funeral was held the following Tuesday at Église Saint-Ignace de Loyola, attended by dozens of co-workers, family, and longtime neighbors. His wife, Mireille, delivered a brief eulogy, remembering him as a quiet man who believed in doing what was right, even when it cost him. Officials conducted a full internal review of how Serge Lamontagne had remained employed on site after his suspension. Workplace safety inspectors also launched an investigation into procedural gaps that may have enabled the attack to occur unnoticed. It was March 15, 2016, when a heated workplace confrontation in a major Midwest city turned deadly, forever changing the lives of two men whose bitter rivalry had been building for months. Clint Harrison, a 34-year-old warehouse supervisor at a mid-sized industrial supply company, was known throughout the facility for his aggressive management style and cruel tendency to publicly humiliate his workers. Standing at 6 feet tall with a commanding presence, Clint ruled his domain with an iron fist, believing that fear and intimidation were the keys to productivity. Martin Webb, 28, operated forklifts on the day shift and had become Clint's primary target over the past 6 months. Webb was a quiet, hard-working family man whose wife was expecting their second child. Despite his stellar safety record spanning 5 years without incident, Clint had systematically written him up for minor infractions, creating a paper trail designed to justify denying Webb a recent promotion to lead operator. Webb's co-workers had witnessed Clint's campaign of harassment, but none dared speak up for fear of becoming targets themselves. The warehouse culture had become toxic under Clint's leadership, with employees walking on eggshells and productivity suffering despite his intimidation tactics. The tension reached a breaking point that Monday afternoon during shift change. Clint had spent the day berating Webb in front of the entire crew, calling him incompetent and threatening termination over a minor paperwork error. As Webb prepared to clock out, Clint cornered him near the loading dock, away from most witnesses. Clint's voice echoed through the empty loading area as he continued his verbal assault, telling Webb he would never amount to anything and that his family would suffer because of his incompetence. He mocked Webb's financial struggles and suggested that maybe his wife would be better off with a real man. When Webb tried to walk away, Clint grabbed his arm and shoved him backward with unnecessary force. In a moment of rage fueled by months of humiliation, Webb grabbed a 3-pound steel pipe wrench from a nearby maintenance cart. Without thinking, driven by pure instinct and overwhelming anger, he swung it at Clint's head with full force. The wrench struck Clint's left temple with a sickening crack, fracturing his skull and causing immediate brain trauma. Clint collapsed instantly, his body hitting the concrete floor with a dull thud as blood began pooling beneath his head. He convulsed briefly, his eyes rolling back before going completely still. The impact had caused a massive subdural hematoma, and Clint died within 2 minutes from severe brain injury and internal bleeding. Webb stood frozen in shock, the wrench still in his trembling hands as he realized what he had done. 2 other employees working nearby had witnessed the entire confrontation and came running when they heard the impact. One immediately called 911, while the other tried unsuccessfully to provide first aid. Webb was arrested and charged with voluntary manslaughter rather than murder, as prosecutors acknowledged the confrontation was not premeditated. During the trial, testimony revealed Clint's systematic pattern of workplace harassment and the mounting financial pressure Webb faced supporting his growing family. The judge sentenced him to 12 years in prison, citing the tragic circumstances, but noting that violence could never be justified. It was October 14th, 2018, when 3 years of neighborhood harassment reached its deadly conclusion on a quiet Sunday afternoon, as what began as a property dispute between neighbors escalated into unthinkable violence that would shatter two families forever. Sarah Mitchell, 34, was a devoted mother of two young children who had endured relentless bullying from her next-door neighbor, Tessa Monroe, 41. What started as complaints about Sarah's children playing too loudly had evolved into a systematic campaign of psychological warfare that included false police reports, deliberate property damage, and increasingly threatening behavior towards Sarah's family. Tessa, a bitter divorcee who worked nights as a security guard, seemed to take perverse pleasure in tormenting the Mitchell family. Her own life had fallen apart after a messy divorce that left her financially struggling and emotionally unstable. She had called Child Protective Services multiple times with fabricated abuse allegations, forcing Sarah to endure humiliating investigations that found no evidence of wrongdoing. The harassment escalated when Tessa began targeting the family pets. She had poisoned their beloved golden retriever, Max, with antifreeze, claiming the dog was too noisy when it barked at strangers. The veterinary bills had cost the Mitchells over $3,000, and Max barely survived the poisoning. That Sunday afternoon, Sarah was tending to her vegetable garden while her 6-year-old daughter Emma played on the swing set. The October air was crisp and peaceful, with colorful leaves scattered across the yard. Tessa emerged from her house in a rage, still wearing her security guard uniform from the previous night's shift. Her hair was disheveled, and her eyes were bloodshot from lack of sleep and alcohol consumption. She began screaming at Emma, claiming the child's laughter was disturbing her sleep and threatening to call the police if the noise didn't stop immediately. When Sarah intervened, rushing to protect her daughter, Tessa escalated the confrontation by threatening to make the whole family disappear and claiming she had connections who could take care of problems like them. The threat was delivered with such venom that Sarah genuinely feared for her family's safety. Emma began crying and ran to hide behind her mother, trembling with fear. The argument moved to the front yard where other neighbors began watching from their windows, some recording the confrontation on their phones. Tessa, emboldened by the audience, grabbed Sarah's garden hose and began spraying both Sarah and Emma with freezing water, soaking their clothes and causing Emma to scream in shock and cold. Sarah, overwhelmed by 3 years of torment and seeing her daughter being physically assaulted, pushed Tessa away from them with both hands. The force was not excessive, but Tessa, who had been drinking and was unsteady on her feet, stumbled backward and fell, striking her head on the sharp concrete edge of her driveway with a sickening crack. The impact caused a severe concussion and immediate brain swelling. Tessa lost consciousness instantly and began having violent seizures, her body convulsing uncontrollably as blood seeped from her head wound onto the concrete. Sarah, overwhelmed by 3 years of psychological torture and seeing her traumatized daughter, made a split-second decision that would haunt her forever. Instead of immediately calling 911, she took Emma inside their house and waited 15 crucial minutes before calling emergency services, claiming she had just discovered her neighbor unconscious after an apparent fall. Tessa died from her brain injuries before paramedics could save her. The delayed emergency response proved critical. Medical experts later testified that immediate treatment could have prevented her death, as the brain swelling could have been controlled with rapid intervention. It was November 18, 2017, when the prestigious university dormitory became the scene of a calculated murder, as academic rivalry and social jealousy drove one student to commit what she believed would be the perfect crime. Bryce Chandler, 19, was a pre-med student whose perfect GPA and effortless social success had made him the target of his roommates' growing resentment and obsessive hatred. Bryce came from a wealthy family in California, maintained straight A's without apparent effort, and was dating the most popular girl on campus. Amanda Torres, 20, was a scholarship student from a working-class family who worked 2 part-time jobs to afford basic necessities like food and textbooks. Despite studying constantly, often until 3 a.m. in the library, she struggled to maintain a B average while watching Bryce excel without breaking a sweat. Amanda's financial stress was overwhelming. She survived on ramen noodles and generic coffee while Bryce ordered expensive takeout. The contrast between their lives was stark and painful. while Amanda wore the same 3 outfits repeatedly and walked everywhere to save money. Bryce had a closet full of designer clothes and complained about having to choose between his Mercedes and BMW for weekend trips home. Amanda discovered that Bryce had a severe peanut allergy that he kept secret from most people, fearing it would affect his social life and dating prospects. Bryce carried an EpiPen in his backpack but rarely mentioned his condition, trusting Amanda with this potentially life-threatening secret. Over several weeks, Amanda researched peanut allergies extensively, learning that even trace amounts could trigger severe reactions in highly sensitive individuals. She began tampering with small amounts of peanut residue in his food and personal items, observing how he reacted without drawing attention. Amanda contaminated Bryce's lip balm, face cream, and even his pillowcase with tiny amounts of peanut residue, causing him to develop mysterious rashes and breathing difficulties that he attributed to stress and poor air quality in the dorm. The plan culminated during finals week, when stress levels were at their highest and Bryce was most vulnerable. Amanda prepared Bryce's favorite protein smoothie using a blender she had deliberately contaminated with peanut butter hours earlier, ensuring maximum cross-contamination. Bryce, touched by what seemed like a rare gesture of kindness from his distant roommate, consumed the entire smoothie while reviewing his notes at his desk. Within minutes, he began experiencing the first symptoms: tingling in his mouth and throat, followed by difficulty swallowing. The allergic reaction progressed rapidly. Bryce's face began swelling, his breathing became labored and wheezy, and his blood pressure started dropping dangerously. He recognized the symptoms immediately and searched frantically for his EpiPen, which Amanda had hidden earlier in the day while Bryce was in class. Amanda watched with cold calculation as Bryce collapsed on the floor, gasping for air and begging Amanda to call 911. Bryce's lips were turning blue, and his swollen throat was making breathing nearly impossible. His eyes were wide with terror as he realized what was happening and that his roommate was making no move to help him. Instead of helping, Amanda sat at her desk and continued studying for her own exam, occasionally glancing at Bryce's deteriorating condition with detached interest. She waited until Bryce stopped breathing entirely before calling emergency services, claiming she had just discovered her roommate unconscious. Bryce died from anaphylactic shock, his body shutting down from the severe allergic reaction. The investigation initially treated it as a tragic accident, until Amanda's internet search history revealed extensive research into peanut allergies, cross-contamination methods, and deliberate poisoning techniques. It was December 25, 2018, when Christmas dinner became a scene of horror, as decades of family resentment and financial manipulation exploded into violence that would destroy an entire bloodline and shatter the illusion of a perfect family. Lana Whitfield, 67, was the wealthy matriarch of a prominent family who had spent years manipulating her children through financial control and emotional abuse. Her late husband had built a successful real estate empire worth over $15 million, and Lana had used this wealth as a weapon to control every aspect of her children's lives. David Whitmore, 42, was Lana's youngest son who had sacrificed his promising career as an architect to serve as her primary caregiver for the past 5 years. He had moved into her mansion, given up his own apartment, and dedicated his life to managing her medical appointments, medications, and daily needs. Despite his devotion, Lana constantly criticized him and threatened to remove him from her will entirely whenever he showed any sign of independence. Lana's manipulation was psychological and systematic. She would promise David inheritance money to keep him dependent, then threaten to disinherit him whenever he considered dating or pursuing his own interests. The family had gathered for their traditional Christmas dinner at Lana's sprawling estate, a ritual that had become increasingly tense over the years. The dining room was elegantly decorated with expensive china and crystal, creating an atmosphere of wealth and tradition that masked the underlying dysfunction. During the meal, Lana announced she was changing her will again, this time leaving everything to a cancer research charity and disinheriting all her children completely. She claimed they were all ungrateful parasites who didn't deserve her wealth, and that she wanted to leave a meaningful legacy rather than support their lazy lifestyles. David, who had given up everything to care for his mother and had no savings or career prospects at age 42, felt his world collapsing. The other siblings had their own careers and families, but David had nothing except his role as caregiver. The argument that followed was explosive, with years of suppressed resentment finally erupting. Lana began listing David's failures and inadequacies in front of the entire family, calling him a disappointment and claiming he had never accomplished anything worthwhile. She mocked his abandoned architectural career and suggested he was too weak and pathetic to survive on his own. When David tried to defend himself, explaining the sacrifices he had made for her care, Lana slapped him hard across the face in front of his nieces and nephews. The slap was not just physical but symbolic, a final rejection of everything he had given up for her. In a moment of pure rage and desperation, David grabbed a heavy crystal vase from the dining room table, an expensive piece that had been in the family for generations. He struck his mother across the head with tremendous force, the crystal shattering on impact and causing severe head trauma. Lana collapsed onto the dining room floor and never regained consciousness. Blood was pooling beneath her gray hair and mixing with the scattered crystal fragments. The elegant Christmas dinner had become a crime scene, with children screaming and adults frozen in shock. David's siblings immediately called 911, and paramedics arrived within minutes. Despite resuscitation attempts, Lana was unresponsive, and her injuries were later determined to be fatal. It was September 22, 2016, when 20 years of buried shame and resentment came to a deadly climax at a high school reunion, as past bullying finally caught up with its perpetrator in the most tragic way possible. Lisa Park, 38, had been the victim of relentless bullying throughout high school, particularly from popular student council president Gavin Pierce and his circle of friends. The harassment had been systematic and cruel, involving public humiliation, social isolation, and psychological torture that had left lasting scars on Lisa's psyche. Gavin, now 38 and a successful marketing executive for a major advertising firm, had never acknowledged or apologized for his role in Lisa's trauma. He had built a successful career on his charisma and social skills, the same qualities that had made him a powerful bully in high school. Lisa had spent 2 decades building a successful career as a forensic accountant, using her analytical skills and attention to detail to uncover financial fraud for major corporations. Despite her professional success, she had struggled with relationships and self-esteem issues that traced directly back to her high school trauma. The reunion was held at an upscale lakeside resort, where many classmates were staying overnight, creating an atmosphere of nostalgia and celebration. Lisa had decided to attend specifically to confront Gavin about the past, hoping for some acknowledgement or apology that might help her find closure. When she finally approached Gavin during the evening social hour, he was surrounded by the same group of friends who had participated in the bullying 20 years earlier. Lisa attempted to have a private conversation with Gavin about how the bullying had affected her life, explaining the suicide attempt, the therapy, and the ongoing struggles with self-worth and relationships. Gavin's response was devastating. He dismissed Lisa's concerns with the same cruelty he had shown in high school, claiming Lisa was being overly dramatic and needed to get over it after all these years. The confrontation moved to the resort's lakeside dock, when Gavin suggested they continue their conversation away from the crowd. The wooden dock stretched over water nearly 12 feet deep, where the lake bed dropped off sharply from the shore. A few aging lamps cast faint reflections across the dark surface as Gavin continued his verbal assault, telling Lisa she was still the same pathetic loser she had been in high school. When Lisa began crying, overwhelmed by the realization that Gavin had learned nothing and felt no remorse, Gavin pushed her and threatened to throw her in the lake like old times, referencing a particularly traumatic incident from their senior year. Lisa, overwhelmed by decades of suppressed rage and fresh humiliation, grabbed Gavin's arm as he shoved her. In the struggle, Gavin lost his balance on the slick boards, pulling Lisa with him as they both plunged into the cold, dark water. Gavin, who had been drinking heavily throughout the evening and was wearing an expensive suit, immediately began struggling to stay afloat in the frigid water. Lisa, who had become a strong swimmer as part of her therapy and self-improvement efforts, could have easily helped Gavin reach the safety of the dock or shore. Instead, she treaded water and watched as Gavin panicked, his alcohol-impaired coordination making it difficult for him to swim effectively. Gavin's struggles became increasingly desperate as the cold water sapped his strength and his heavy clothing dragged him down. He called out for help, his voice echoing across the lake. But Lisa remained motionless in the water, watching her former tormentor fight for his life. Lisa swam to shore and climbed out, claiming Gavin had fallen in accidentally while they were talking near the dock. Several reunion guests nearby heard the argument growing louder, and then a sudden splash, though the darkness made it hard to see what actually happened on the lake. The investigation revealed Lisa's motive and her deliberate failure to rescue Gavin despite being an excellent swimmer and having multiple opportunities to save him. It was January 15, 2020, when Rebecca Lawson's prestigious medical career came to a devastating end, as her history of negligence and arrogance finally caught up with her in the most personal and tragic way possible. Rebecca, 52, was a renowned cardiac surgeon whose exceptional technical skills were overshadowed by her arrogance, substance abuse, and willingness to cut corners when it suited her schedule or financial interests. Nurse Nora Martinez, 29, had worked under Rebecca for 3 years in the cardiac surgery unit and had witnessed multiple instances of negligence, patient abuse, and dangerous shortcuts that put lives at risk. Martinez had filed numerous complaints with hospital administration, documenting instances where Rebecca had operated while intoxicated, falsified medical records, and blamed complications on other staff members to avoid responsibility. However, Rebecca's reputation as a skilled surgeon and her ability to generate revenue for the hospital made her virtually untouchable. The breaking point came when Rebecca's negligence during a routine cardiac procedure resulted in the death of Martinez's 8-year-old nephew, Miguel, who had been born with a correctable heart defect. Martinez discovered that Rebecca had been drinking heavily before Miguel's surgery, consuming alcohol in her office during her lunch break before entering the operating room. During the procedure, Rebecca made critical errors that directly caused Miguel's death. She punctured the child's aorta while attempting to repair the septal defect, causing massive internal bleeding that could not be controlled. Miguel died on the operating table after nearly an hour of uncontrolled bleeding, while Rebecca and the team struggled to stabilize him, not out of duty, but to avoid the consequences of her negligence. After Miguel's death, Rebecca falsified medical records to make it appear that the child had died from unexpected complications rather than a surgical error. When Martinez attempted to report the truth to authorities, Rebecca used her influence to have Martinez fired and blacklisted from other hospitals in the region. Martinez's sister was devastated by Miguel's death and never recovered from the loss of her only child. Martinez spent months planning her revenge, using her medical knowledge and access to hospital supplies to devise what she believed would be an untraceable method of murder. She obtained a job at a private surgical clinic, where Rebecca occasionally performed procedures for wealthy patients. The opportunity came on a day when Rebecca arrived at the clinic suffering from severe food poisoning. Despite her obvious illness, nausea, vomiting, and dehydration, she refused to cancel her scheduled surgery on a wealthy businessman, driven by her pride and the substantial fee involved. Standard medical protocol required her to stay off duty to protect both her health and that of her patients, but she insisted on receiving IV fluids and medication to stabilize herself before operating. As Rebecca lay in the treatment room, hooked to an IV and basic monitors, she was groggy from the anti-nausea medication, but still responsive. When the other nurse stepped out briefly, Martinez took her chance. She slipped a syringe into the IV port and slowly injected potassium chloride, a substance that, in high doses, stops the heart by disrupting its electrical rhythm. The clinic stocked potassium chloride for routine post-operative care in pre-mixed IV solutions. Martinez, familiar with the supply system, had quietly drawn several doses into a syringe earlier that day. The drug was kept in a locked cabinet, but staff access was loosely monitored, a common gap in smaller private facilities. Within about a minute, Rebecca's monitors erupted as her heartbeat faltered and then flatlined. To the team rushing back in, the collapse appeared to be a sudden complication from her illness. Despite repeated defibrillation and cardiac medications, She could not be revived. Clinic security reviewed footage of Martinez's activities during Rebecca's treatment, and toxicology later confirmed abnormally high potassium levels inconsistent with her medical condition. Martinez was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. During her trial, she showed no remorse for Rebecca's death, stating that she had prevented the surgeon from killing more innocent patients and that justice had finally been served for Miguel and all of Rebecca's other victims. Thanks for watching. Want to watch more? Click on your screen now.